Hi, my name is Ben, and today I am reviewing A Different Man, which stars Sebastian Stan and is released by A24. Have to fully admit, going into this movie, seeing the trailer, I just wasn't really feeling it. I was very apprehensive to walk into this theater. The tone, the idea of what this movie was about, what it had to say about representation, it just wasn't clicking with me. The dark humor really just was not selling me in the trailer. So I was very nervous walking in. Have to say, pleasantly surprised by what I got with A Different Man, a movie that I don't think I was expecting, but really liked the way that it went about. So A Different Man stars Sebastian Stan, Renate Reinsve, and Adam Pearson. And this film follows aspiring actor Edward, played by Stan, who undergoes a drastic medical procedure to transform his physical appearance, only to find his new dream face comes at the price of losing out on the role he was born to play, consuming him to chase back what was lost. That is the premise of this movie, and essentially what the ideas of A Different Man are is this is a movie that is exploring self-confidence versus self-appearance. I would personally describe A Different Man as a psychological fable of a man in search of his own desires, only to be gifted them and discover that his life is meaningless and nothing changes in it. And then finally, what this film is exploring is actors and the state of Hollywood casting right now that explores the questions, should actors be allowed to play any role they want? Those are the big ideas of this movie. So I wanted to just kind of focus in on each of them. Let's just start off with what I think is maybe the most controversial / confusing of this, and especially with how it's brought about in media today. It is the state of Hollywood casting, which is a big fundamental idea of this movie. Essentially, we have the character of Edward, who looked one way in his life, and then after this surgery no longer looks like that person. And then you have Oswald, who looks the part, who can act the part, and also represents the part. And it's this confusing psychological torment. And now you have this aspect of Edward, who is essentially being told, oh, you can't play this character. You don't have the experience. You don't look like this guy, even though for most of his life, Edward looked like this guy and understood this story better than anyone. So it's this kind of weird, trippy movie in that way. Some people are really going to respond to it. Other people aren't going to love it. I will say what A Different Man does so well, especially in its writing from Aaron Schimberg, who wrote and directed this movie, is this movie never takes sides on that issue. It kind of explores the fundamentals of both sides of those issues, and it makes you understand who Edward is, and it makes you understand who Oswald is. It makes you understand the critics who are against the idea of actors not being allowed to play everybody, and it also explores why some actors believe they have a God-given right to play anyone. It's a fascinating exploration in that way. And it's a psychological nightmare in the sense that we see Edward undergo and get a new face in this movie. We then see a play based on his old appearance, his old face, and then questions become if he's right for the part because of his new face, despite the fact that he's lived those experiences. There is definitely more to that, and I'm trying to not go into it just due to fear of spoilers. That is the broad premise of what Edward is struggling with in this movie, especially when we're introduced to the Oswald character in this movie, played by Adam Pearson, who is an actor with deformities. He is incredible in this movie, just straight up incredible. He is the charisma of this movie. The movie changes dimensions when he comes on screen, and it becomes about something else. He enters in around the hour mark of this film, and it becomes a really crazy journey in this movie. And essentially what you have is you have this character in Edward who has been living his whole life with self-doubt, and it's because of his deformity. He believes certain things about himself. It's this disfigurement describes and defines him. Thus, to him, he has no self-confidence. There is no chance at him finding romantic kinship. He believes himself to be a victim of his circumstances in appearance, and thus he undergoes the choice to get a new face and essentially reinvent himself. And his life is going well. He's become successful. And then he meets this character of Oswald, who's up for this part that Edward is up for. And Oswald is disfigured, and yet, unlike for Edward, that doesn't disqualify anything that Oswald does. It does not define him. Everything that Edward thinks he himself couldn't do, Oswald does it. He defies expectations in Edward's mind, where Edward is nervous about romance and doesn't believe himself capable of love. Oswald seems to have engaged in multiple pleasures with women. Where Edward wants to go through life without people looking at him, Oswald is the center of attention. He is essentially the prom king. He is a gifted actor because of all of this confidence. And yet Edward himself is then feeling like, I've lived those experiences. How don't I have those feelings? It's this, for Edward, his appearance blinds him, and he believes that his appearance defines his self-worth and ability. And yet when his appearance changes, nothing else changes about him of substance. And thus he's in this weird, almost enemy combat mode with Oswald the entire time, where you can clearly tell he is jealous of him. And as the self-hatred starts to fill up, we see this character become more drastic in fun and exciting ways. Sebastian Stan plays the heck out of this performance. You feel every emotion that he gives in this movie. You feel the mania. It's a performance that actually reminded me a lot of what Demi just did with The Substance. I think this film is actually in communication with that film, in the sense that a lot of them share the same ideas of self-worth and self-image. So you have these two characters dynamic in Oswald and Edward, and everything becomes a little bit more complicated when Renate enters the picture. She plays Ingrid in this movie, who is a playwright who writes a play about a disfigured, lonely man based on Edward's life, though no one is actually necessarily aware of that outside of Edward himself. And this character, this performance from Renate is wonderful. This is kind of the most important performance in this movie, and I think it's the one that audiences are going to really be turned off by, but it's also the reason this movie works for me, is because this movie is in many ways about exploitation and the exploitative fetishization versus genuine connection, because we have this character in Ingrid who is, you can tell from the very first time she's on screen, has a chemistry with Edward that Edward has clearly never felt, and thus Edward is not able to reciprocate it. And on that, he doesn't believe himself to even be correct on that. It almost seems like he himself is not believing in what is clearly happening that we as an audience can see. But you can also tell right away with Ingrid, she's very self-serving. She is very self-centered. She is very interested in Edward's face and appearance. And then she writes this play about him that very often feels like fetishization. It is, again, this question of representation. And what I found so interesting about this is we get so lost in the weeds about talking about who is fit to play such a role that we often forget to ask the bigger question of who gets to tell the stories about these roles. And that's what Ingrid's role in this movie is. She is the playwright. She is the author of, for lack of a better words, disfigurement and disfigurement representation within this world. And thus what you're left with is these three characters, all with this certain level of romantic sexual chemistry between each other, all kind of vying it out within each other, and yet it's so passive aggressive in their friendliness. I really liked how this movie went, and it takes some really big choices, especially in the final 30 minutes, that I could understand why audiences get turned off by it. I think it is what makes the movie so strong and so rewarding. Without going into spoilers, I just believe the ending, especially what the character of Edward, played by Sebastian Stan, does, is just one of the most fascinating explorations of self-worth and self-image that we've seen. And then we see this character in Edward battling with his own insecurities, and it becomes a race of, will he get better? Will he understand self-love? Or is this going to be the defining thing in his life, despite his new appearance of looking like Sebastian Stan? It's a wonderful movie. I can highly recommend it. I am going 4 out of 5 stars for A Different Man.